You heard, some of the words there from President Putin's statement there. We've heard other Russian officials imply, without evidence, that some sort of connection is made there between the terrorists and Ukraine. Why do you believe Putin either believes it or says it?
Well, whether he believes it is another question. He's saying it because their primary mission right now is to convince the Russian people that Putin is absolved of responsibility for either preventing this attack or for the, really, you have to say, botched response. So that's their primary objective. And you can see they're having difficulty kind of putting the pieces of this narrative together. But essentially, it all goes back to Ukraine in their view. And President Putin coming out with that kind of indirect statement, crossing the border and a window prepared for them. So it's not really clear, but they want to put the finger on Ukraine and try to go with that narrative. But I think the domestic considerations right now are really, really important. Russians have been through many terror attacks, and once again, they are the victims. And it looks like the government and Putin did not protect them.
And Kim, the Kremlin says 11 suspects have been arrested so far, including 4 directly responsible for the attack. Russia's Interior Ministry was quick to point out that all of the detained suspects are foreign citizens, and it is likely that they are also being interrogated about their alleged responsibility. What kind of messaging does it send to the Russian people?
Well, as Jill was saying, that this is not something that Moscow could have foreseen. They're setting up this narrative that outside help was given to carry out this attack, so that even if they do eventually that this was an ISIL Khorasan offshoot attack, that somehow the nemesis Ukraine was implicated or at least helped out. Now, Russia has a long-standing battle against ISIS. In Syria, it battled against ISIS on behalf of the Assad regime, which it has continued to support and prop up. And in Afghanistan, Russia is an ally of the Taliban, and ISIS-K, of course, has been carrying out attacks against the Taliban and anyone allied with the Taliban. Also, the FSB, the Russian State Security Services, have talked about stopping various ISIS plots inside the country. So there's a definite smoking gun here. They just don't want to talk about that, because then the question is, did Putin let his eye off the ball because he was conducting a war of conquest against Ukraine?
And then, John, what is the distinction, if there is one, between ISIS, which is being blamed for earlier attempted attacks, versus this incident, which is being pinned on an ISIS-K?
So ISIS has been degraded to the point of struggling to still exist. But ISIS-K, or ISIS Khorasan, has been the external operations planning for terrorist attacks operation within ISIS for a number of years. And even as ISIS has been degraded to the point of nearly disappearing, ISIS Khorasan, operating in the shadowy regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan with affiliates elsewhere in South Asia, has continued to launch attacks in the name of ISIS. 2022, a suicide bombing against the Russian embassy in Afghanistan. Of course, during the U.S. withdrawal, ISIS-K was tagged with responsibility for the devastating suicide bomb attack that killed so many who were trying to flee, as well as U.S. Marines and soldiers. And as Jill points out, as Kim points out, ISIS-K, the propaganda, the history has been against Russia, against Afghanistan, against their growing allegiance. So it's a narrative that makes sense. At the same time, Putin has to rewrite that narrative carefully, one that accepts the rest of the intelligence communities of the world may attribute this to ISIS and ISIS-K, but he needs to make this more than just a security failure, but try to recast it as Russia's October 7th, at least cast that there are some Ukraine fingerprints on it, and we're seeing those wheels spin today.
And then, Jill, this attack comes just a week after the Russian presidential election. So how will Vladimir Putin, I guess, try to distance this attack from his new leadership as he's now in his 5th term?
I think there's an interesting pivot he has to do. He has to say, I'm not responsible, but this is a war. So, and you saw that in his comments right after, well, actually this morning, I believe, when he was urging Russians, we are all united. This will never happen again. It's interesting to note, I think, Fred, that you have his spokesperson now using the word war to describe the war in Ukraine. Before it was a special military operation, but now it is war. And then you also have the defense minister talking about creating 3 more armies. And that means you need more men. And that could mean a full mobilization of the fighting force. That's something the Kremlin really needed to do, but didn't want to do because of the possible response by the Russian public. It could be that they are now moving toward that.
And then, Kim, do you see that President Putin is going to use this attack as further impetus to change the strategy in Ukraine?
Well, he certainly seems to be laying the groundwork for blaming Kyiv in some manner, shape, or form. And that will feed into his longstanding plan that he keeps moving forward with. He's put Russia on a war footing. He's secured military supplies to get to his troops. And now he just needs to shore up the Russian public's drive and desire to continue this war. Whatever happened actually at the theater, he's going to make this part of that.
And then, John, now that we've seen this attack in Russia, what kind of notice does this put other nations on, even after Western nations, including the U.S., issued warnings to Putin that something like this would happen? But now that this has actually happened, do you see the U.S. and other Western nations putting themselves on high alert?
Well, it certainly underscores that ISIS-Khorasan still has external operations that go beyond Afghanistan and Pakistan, but the ability to reach into and recruit in other countries if, in fact, the attribution to them holds. And it's still, as my colleagues pointed out today, out of crisis comes opportunity. And we can certainly see that Vladimir Putin is trying to figure out how to best use this, whether it's going to be in his countermeasures in Russia or his war efforts in Ukraine.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much to all of you. John Miller, Kim Dozier, Jill Doherty.